morning, everyone. I'm Nico, Head of Sustainability at Parry. I look both after our internal efforts when it comes to sustainability, so our B Corp certification and recertification, making it business as usual, our net zero strategy, our reporting, and so on and so forth. And I'm also helping our clients who want to be on a similar journey. Right, ESG. That's environmental, social, and governance. If you feel like companies are paying more attention to ESG than before, or at least being more vocal about it, there's a pretty good reason for that. They kind of have to. The UK government is gearing up to enact significant changes when it comes to sustainability reporting, with Europe and the States being already ahead. As the rapid evolution of ESG reporting can be challenging to track and apply, I thought it would be useful to do a bit of a whiz through the legislation, the ESG legislation at the moment, how they interact with each other, and also what they mean for companies in 2023 and beyond. Nope. Just bear with me. I'm sure something is going to happen. Help me out with this. Thank you very much. Right, I'll move on while we sort out the slides. You'll hear me talking quite a bit about emission, and legislation does too. So let's set the scene on this first. The globally recognized GHG protocol standard classifies, thank you very much, no.
Someone kicked the
I'll move on while we sort it out. Right, so as I've mentioned, the GHG protocol classifies emission into three scopes. You have your scope 1 emissions. These are from your controlled or owned sources. So think gas consumption, fuel used in company-owned vehicles. You also have your scope 2 emissions. That's your indirect emissions from energy purchase. So that's your electricity consumption. And finally, you have your scope 3 emissions. That's called the monster in the ESG space. So that's all the indirect emissions from your value chain. This is further split into 15 categories. Few examples, but not exhaustive. You'll have your business travel, your waste, purchase goods and services, upstream and downstream transport and distribution, the impact of your products once they are being sold to the customer. So it goes on and on. Majority of companies focus on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. However, between 85 to 95% of an organization emissions actually sit in scope 3, and they're the most difficult to control and to report on. In terms of the current ESG reporting landscape at the moment, you have a mix between the FCA listing rules, climate-related legislation, and the voluntary reporting, or otherwise called the alphabet soup of ESG reporting. I'll focus today on the mandatory, and we'll leave the voluntary standards for another time, because otherwise we'll be here for quite a number of hours. We'll start with the basics like SECR and NESOS, and then we'll move into the large or listed territory, that's TCFD reporting, and then how it all fits under the International Sustainability Standards Board that's coming soon. And I'll also mention briefly one that is relevant for companies going after government contracts. Energy Saving Opportunity Scheme. This is an energy assessment program running every 5 years for qualifying businesses. We're now in phase 3 of the program, which had a qualifying deadline of December 22 and a compliance deadline of December 23. However, the Environment Agency changed the compliance deadline to June 24 now in order to allow more time for businesses to implement the phase 3 changes. Qualifying businesses need to meet one of the two criteria. So either if they have employees above 250, or if they have turnover above 44 million and balance sheet above 38 million. For groups, if one undertaking meets the criteria, then its entire operation must take part in ESOS. There are a few exemptions available. So if total energy consumption is less than 40,000 kilowatt per hour, or if you have an ISO 5001 energy management system. The audits, which for most part are carried out by third parties, will result in energy saving recommendations, implementation of which is optional. However, my advice would be to consider this energy savings recommendations and try to implement them, as most likely they will lead to cost reductions as well, and quite a lot of times with minimal investment required. In terms of expected changes, the phase 4 threshold is expected to align with SCCR qualifying criteria, which will mean lowering the turnover and balance sheet numbers. And also there will be a requirement to publish a net zero assessment and emission reduction trajectories. Implementing a net zero strategy takes time and resources, and especially for companies that didn't meet the phase 3 qualifying criteria, but are now meeting it for phase 4, it will be quite a complex exercise. So it's better to at least start thinking about it earlier and start measuring some of the emissions early before you have to get to a net zero assessment. Streamlined energy and carbon reporting, I think this is the one that most people are familiar with it. It applies to all UK entities meeting certain size criteria. That's 2 out of 3. So turnover to be above 36 million, balance sheet to be above 80 million, and employee numbers to be above 250. Entities include quoted companies, large and quoted, LLPs, and academy trusts, and the disclosures need to be presented in the director report, and at the minimum to disclose energy consumption used to calculate emissions, scope 1 emissions, so that's your gas consumption and fuel for transport purposes, scope 2 emissions from purchased electricity, scope 3 emissions, that's only business travel in rental cars or employee-owned vehicles, so that's only a tiny fraction of the total scope 3 emissions. And also an intensity ratio and the methodology used to calculate emissions. Similar to ESOs, there are a few exemptions available. Same exemption if the energy consumption is less than 40,000 kilowatt per hour. And also comply or explain exemptions. That's if obtaining the information would be seriously prejudicial to the interest of the organization or not practical to obtain, although I've rarely seen this exemption being taken. In terms of what's next, the UK government is formally required to review the SCCR regulations within 5 years. This takes us to 1st of April 2024. The main expected change is more scope 3 reporting. The UK government has already published a call for evidence in October in respect of scope 3 reporting. So all the trends are going in that direction, that SCCR reporting will require more scope 3 measurement. There's also an expectation to have mandatory verification over the emissions reporting. Mandatory use of the GHG protocol. At the moment, the calculation methodology is based on the GHG, but it's not entirely following the GHG protocol, so there's an expectation for that to change. And also there will be more emphasis on setting and meeting targets. So essentially they are trying to move away from strictly a measurement disclosure more into a net zero strategy, decarbonization strategy disclosure. Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. This one, it's mandatory. It's recently been published, fairly recently, and it's mandatory for any company with more than 500 employees and above 500 million turnover. They need to report climate-related financial information and climate-related risks and opportunities. Disclosures are at group level, so if thresholds and reporting apply on a consolidated basis. Few examples of disclosures, but by no means an exhaustive list, are governance arrangements in assessing and managing climate-related risks, principal climate-related opportunities and risk and its impacts on the business model and strategy, climate change scenario analysis, and this one seems to be the most difficult for companies to grasp with, and also metrics and targets related to the risk identified, but TCFD at the moment is not specifying which metrics. So the companies can choose which metrics are applicable to them. While there's no specific requirement to disclose emissions, all companies reporting under TCFD will be reporting under SCCR as well. And as meaningful targets and KPIs will increasingly involve reductions in scope 3 emissions, it's best practice to begin measuring and including this data set early. The most common approach to TCFD reporting is to include the disclosures into the strategic report, although I've seen companies that are producing standalone TCFD reports. In terms of what's next, as the volume of publicly made disclosures under the TCFD increases, we expect that companies will learn as they go along. Everyone is on a bit of a learning journey on this, but they will seek to enhance the quality of their disclosure by absorbing the information that is publicly available. Also, with the increased volume and complexity of disclosures, there's an expectation and a heightened demand for formal assurance, especially with greenwashing being pretty much on everybody's lips nowadays. An ISSB, which I'll cover in a minute, is expected to be added as a bolt-on to existing TCFD requirements, which will bring another layer of complexity to the reporting. While TCFD is not affecting the mid-market, the SMEs companies that much into direct reporting, they will get increasingly affected through the supply chain. Companies that report under TCFD or ISSB into the future will need to gather information from their supply chain. So SMEs might not have to report into the market directly, but they'll certainly need to report up to their supply chain. So again, emissions, because if you think the TCFD reporter scope 3 emissions are your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, so you will start not already see questions around that. International Sustainability Standards Board. This is one to watch out for. It's a set of measures and modifications that are aligned to the IFRS Sustainable Disclosure Standards, and it was issued by ISSB in June 23. UK Sustainable Disclosure Standards was formed in order to address the ISSB application in the UK. So UK has made a formal commitment to adhere to ISSB. It's expected to publish the requirements in July 24, so they are moving quite at a fast pace with it. DSDS essentially aims to institutionalize and unify ACCR, TCFD, and ESOS reporting into an overall annual set of sustainability reporting. And while this might be a bit complex to start with, its whole aim is to simplify the reporting going forward, so you know exactly which direction companies are going. It has two standards, Sustainability 1 and Sustainability 2. They haven't been very original with naming this, which also incorporates TCFD already. So that's why the expectation is that it will be a bolt-on to TCFD. However, the main important change to TCFD is it will make Scope 3 reporting mandatory. There will be some additional non-climate sustainability and ESG reporting disclosures, and it will also require for a detailed transition plan outlining the company's path to net zero. So again, it links back to the ESOS expected changes to the ACCR expected changes, and we can see they are merging into the same requirement, similar requirement. It's also expected to introduce a UK green taxonomy, similar to the EU sustainability legislation. However, this is a bit up in the air at the moment. There hasn't been a clear confirmation on that. So I think it will come after the July 24 deadline. Right, final one for the time being. There's Public Policy Note 0621. So this is the one that it's applicable to companies that are looking to pick up government contracts that are worth more than 5 million a year over the course of the contract. The companies in scope, they need to commit to achieving a net zero by 2050, and they need to detail their environmental management measures during the performance of the contract. This carbon reduction plan must include current emissions for Scope 1 and Scope 2, but also a defined subset of Scope 3 emissions. That's business travel, employee commuting, waste generated in operations, and upstream and downstream transportation and distribution. This government initiative provides a template for procurers in the market on what to ask for. So again, linking back to the TCFD report, reporters to larger companies, they will start to ask similar sort of reporting information as the government policy note is introducing. If you take one thing only from this ESG reporting whiz through, let it be this: start managing your company emissions, including Scope 3. When looking at the current market forces and what's next in sustainability reporting, it's clear that the number one converging KPI is carbon reporting, and especially Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and Scope 2 are already covered through legislation, as we've seen in XCCR. Reporting on Scope 3 emissions is currently still largely voluntary, but change is imminent. Scope 3 emissions are the most difficult to calculate and control. So it may be tempting to do the legal minimum on this, but they usually account for the largest proportion of an organization emissions, and it's becoming increasingly unacceptable to ignore them. By looking after your emissions, including your scope 3 emissions, there are also some strong business reasons and benefits in doing so. It will bring you cost savings. Your scope 3 emissions are those associated with the activities of your business, but not directly involved. So it will be it will be your supply chain and your value chain. So by engaging and analyzing the activities and the information in your supply chain, you will do this forensic look of your costs, which ultimately will lead to identifying inefficiencies and unnecessary costs. So cost savings. It will help you get ready for a net zero target. A lot of companies are starting to sign up to the Science Based Targets Initiative. For those that haven't heard about SBTi is the international organization that essentially gives their seal of approval of net zero targets being aligned with science. SBTi makes it mandatory to include your scope 3 emissions if they make up more than 40% of your total company emissions, and most likely they will. So essentially you won't be able to submit a net zero target to SBTi without including your scope 3 emissions. And even if you're not interested in submitting to SBTi, any credible net zero target will need to include scope 3 emissions. To give you access to better finance deals, all major banks in UK nowadays have signed up to become net zero by 2050 and reduce their financed emissions. What this means in practice is that all banks will be on the hook for every single mortgage, every single corporate and business loan, understanding its impact and trying to reduce it. By reducing it, essentially, their scope 3 financed emissions, again, will be the business loans they have with the companies. So by offering incentives for the companies to lower their emissions, they will manage to lower their emissions themselves. So ESG, we see quite a big trend in the market at the moment for ESG-linked loans, which see you having a better margin on your loan if you're meeting certain targets, particularly focused on emissions. Parry is a living example of this. And finally, it will help you future-proof your compliance, because as you've seen, there are more and more changes coming down the line in this space. Thank you very much.